Neither of these two things could justly be permitted to happen. So he gave way to her constitution, and proposing that the nation should be no less indebted to him for his absence from the scene than for Hannibal's, he went off into retirement at Liternum. I've seen the house, which is built of squared stone blocks, the wall surrounding the park, and the towers built out on both sides of the house for purposes of defence. The well concealed among the greenery and outbuildings, with sufficient water to provide for the needs of a whole army. And the tiny little bath, situated after the old-fashioned custom in an ill-lit corner, our ancestors believing that the only place where one could properly have a hot bath was in the dark. It was this which started in my mind reflections that occasioned me a good deal of enjoyment as I compared Scipio's way of life and our own. In this corner, the famous terror of Carthage, to whom Rome owes it that she has only once in her history been captured, used to wash a body weary from work on the farm. For he kept himself fit through toil, cultivating his fields by his own labour, as was the regular way in the old days. And this was the ceiling, dingy in the extreme, under which he stood, and this the equally undistinguished paving that carried his weight. Who is there who could bear to have a bath in such surroundings nowadays? We think ourselves poorly off, living like paupers, if the walls are not ablaze with large and costly circular mirrors, if our Alexandrian marbles are not decorated with panels of Numidian marble, if the whole of their surface has not been given a decorative overlay of elaborate patterns, having all the variety of fresco murals, unless the ceiling cannot be seen for glass, unless the pools into which we lower bodies with all the strength drained out of them by lengthy periods in the sweating room are edged with Thasian marble, which was once the rarest of sights, even in a temple, unless the water pours from silver taps. And so far, we have only been talking about the ordinary fellow's plumbing. What about the bathhouses of certain former slaves? Look at their arrays of statues, their assemblies of columns that do not support a thing, but are put up purely for ornament, just for the sake of spending money. Look at the cascades of water splashing noisily down from one level to the next. We have actually come to such a pitch of choosiness that we object to walking on anything other than precious stones. In this bathroom of Scipio's, there are tiny chinks, you could hardly call them windows, pierced in the masonry of the wall, in such a way as to let in light without in any way weakening its defensive character. Nowadays, moth hole is the way some people speak of a bathroom, unless it has been designed to catch the sun through enormous windows all day long, unless a person can acquire a tan at the same time as he is having a bath, unless he has views from the bath over countryside and sea. The result is that bathhouses, which drew admiring crowds when they were first opened, are actually dismissed as antiquated as soon as extravagance has hit on any novelty calculated to put its own best previous efforts in the shade. There was a time when bathhouses were few and far between, and never in the least luxuriously appointed. And why should they have been, considering that they were designed for use, not for diversion, and that admission only cost you a copper? There were no showers in those days, and the water did not come in a continuous gush, as if from a hot spring. People did not think it mattered then how clear the water was in which they were going to get rid of the dirt. Heavens, what a pleasure it is to go into one of those half-lit bathhouses with their ordinary plastered ceilings, where you knew that Cato himself as Aedile, or Fabius Maximus, or one of the Cornelii, regulated the warmth of your water with his own hand. For however high their rank, it was one of the duties of the Aediles to enter all such premises as were open to the public and enforce standards of cleanliness and a healthy sort of temperature, sufficient for practical purposes, not the kind of heat which has recently come into fashion, more like that of a furnace, so much so indeed that a slave convicted on a criminal charge might well be sentenced to be bathed alive. There doesn't seem to me to be any difference now between your baths warm and your baths boiling. How primitive! Such is some people's verdict these days on Scipio, because he did not have extensive areas of glass to let the daylight into the perspiring room, because it was not a habit with him to stew in strong sunlight, letting the time go by until he was perfectly cooked in his own bathroom. What a sorry wretch of a man! He didn't know how to live. He'd take his bath in water that was never filtered, and often cloudy, practically muddy, in fact, after heavy rain. Well, it did not make much difference to Scipio, if this was the kind of bath he had. He went there to wash off sweat, not scent. And what do you think some people will say to this? Well, I don't envy Scipio. If that was the kind of bath he had all the time, it was a real exile's life that he was leading. Yes, and what's more, if you must know, he didn't even have a bath every day. Writers who have left us a record of life in ancient Rome tell us that it was just their arms and legs, which of course they dirtied working, that people washed every day, bathing all over only once a week on market day. Obviously, someone will comment, there must have been times when they were positively disgusting. And what do you think they stank of? I'll tell you, of hard soldiering, of hard work, of all that goes to make up a man. Men are dirtier creatures now than they ever were in the days before the coming of spotlessly clean bathrooms. What is it Horace says when he wants to describe a man noted and indeed notorious for the inordinate length to which he carried personal fastidiousness? Bucillus stinks of scented lozenges. Produce Bucillus today, with whom Horace contrasted him. For nowadays, it is not even enough to use some scented ointment. It must be reapplied 2 or 3 times a day as a precaution against its evaporation on the person. I say nothing about the way people preen themselves on the perfume it carries, as if it were their own. If all this strikes you as being excessively disapproving, you must put it down to the house's atmosphere. During my stay in it, I've learned from Aegialus, who is the present owner of the estate and gives a great deal of attention to its management, that trees can be transplanted, even when quite old, a lesson that we old men need to learn when we reckon that every one of us who puts down a new olive plantation is doing so for someone else's benefit. Now that I've seen him carefully transplanting one of a number of trees that had given fruit unstintingly over 3 and even 4 seasons. So you too can enjoy the shade of the tree which is slow in coming up, is there to give your grandson shade in later years, long hence, according to our Virgil, who was not concerned with the facts, but with poetic effect, his object being the pleasure of the reader, not the instruction of the farmer. To pick out only one example, let me quote the following passage, which I felt compelled to find fault with today. In spring's the time for sowing beans, then too the crumbling furrows. Clover, welcome you, and millet too, receives her yearly care. I leave you to conclude from this whether the crops mentioned are to be planted at the same time as each other, and whether in each case they're to be sown in spring. As I write, it's June, getting on for July now too. And I've seen people harvesting beans and sowing millet on the same day. To get back to our olive plantation, I saw 2 different methods of planting used here. In the first, taking sizable trees and lopping off the branches, cutting them back to a foot from the stem, Aegialus transplanted them complete with crown, pruning away the roots and leaving only the actual base, the part to which the roots are attached. This he placed in the hole with an application of manure, and not only earthed it in, but trod and stamped the soil down hard. He says that nothing gives such good results as this packing them down, as he calls it. What it does, of course, is to keep out cold and wind, and apart from that, the tree is less liable to be shifted, thus allowing the young roots to sprout and get a grip on the soil, when they are inevitably tender and torn from their precarious holds by the slightest disturbance. He also scrapes the crown of the tree before covering it up, because, he says, new roots emerge wherever the wood underneath has been laid bare. The tree again should not stand higher than 3 or 4 feet above the ground. This will ensure, right from the start, green growth from the bottom upwards, instead of a large area of dry and withered stem of the sort one sees in old olive groves. The second method was as follows. Taking branches of the type one normally finds on very young trees, strong but at the same time having soft bark, he planted them out in the same sort of way. These grow rather more slowly, but since they spring from what is virtually a cutting, there is nothing scraggy or unsightly about them. Another thing I've seen is the transplanting of an old vine from its supporting tree. In this case, one has to gather up with it, if possible, even the minute root hairs, and in addition, give it a more generous covering of soil, so that it throws out roots from the stem as well. I have seen such plantings not only in the month of February, but even at the end of March, the vines going on to embrace and take good hold of their new elm trees. Aegialus also says that all trees which are stout in the stem, if one may so term them, should have the benefit of a supply of water stored in tanks. If this is a